The morning mist clung to the mountainside like old memories refusing to fade. Eleanor Ellie Morrison stood on what remained of the front porch, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of instant coffee, watching the sun struggle through the canopy of ancient oaks. At 45, she felt every year etched into her bones. The long hours at the consulting firm in Boston, the divorce that had drained her savings and spirit after 18 years of marriage, the gradual realization that the life she'd built bore no resemblance to the dreams she'd once carried. The cabin behind her groaned in the morning breeze, a symphony of settling wood and rusty hinges that spoke of decades without care. Paint peeled from the siding like old skin, and the front steps sagged dangerously under even her modest weight. Vines had claimed the eastern wall, their tendrils creeping through broken windows and gaps in the foundation. What had once been her grandfather's pride, she remembered that much from childhood visits, now looked like nature's slow victory over human ambition. But it was hers now, the only thing James Morrison had left behind when he passed 3 months ago, along with a letter that had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. The envelope had been yellow with age, sealed with red wax bearing the impression of a small hammer crossed with what looked like a chisel. Inside, her grandfather's careful script had spelled out instructions that made little sense at the time. Look beneath what others see, Ellie girl. The real treasure was always hidden from plain sight. She'd driven up from Boston yesterday, her Honda loaded with sleeping bags, canned goods, and a stubborn determination to understand what the old man had meant. The key had been right where his letter said it would be, under the third stone from the corner of what used to be a garden wall. The townspeople she'd encountered at the gas station had looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement when she'd asked for directions to the Morrison place. You, James's granddaughter? The station owner had asked, his weathered face creasing with what might have been sympathy. Heard he passed. Sorry for your loss. Then, with the directness mountain people were known for, hope you're not thinking of trying to live up there. That place has been falling down for 20 years. Be cheaper to buy a tent. Similar conversations had followed at the hardware store and the small grocery market. Everyone remembered James Morrison, but their memories were tinged with the same gentle condescension she'd grown accustomed to in her corporate life. He'd been a character, they said, kept to himself mostly, had some kind of workshop back there, but nobody knew what he made anymore. Old-fashioned fellow was how Martha Henley, the librarian, had put it, always tinkering with wood and such. Never saw much come of it, though. Now standing in the ruins of his world, Ellie wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The practical part of her mind, the part that had thrived in boardrooms and quarterly reviews, whispered that she should cut her losses, sell the land for whatever it would bring, pay off the rest of her divorce debts, and find a reasonable apartment back in Boston. But something about the morning light filtering through the broken shutters reminded her of being 8 years old, sitting on the same porch, while her grandfather whittled small animals from pieces of oak and maple. His hands had been sure then, carving rabbits and deer with a precision that had seemed magical to her young eyes. Every piece of wood has a story hiding inside it, Ellie, he told her. You just have to be patient enough to let it speak. The memory stirred something she'd thought lost forever, a sense of wonder, of possibilities existing beyond spreadsheets and profit margins. Where are you tuning in from today? If this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of a truck engine broke through her reverie. An older model pickup rumbled up the dirt road and parked beside her Honda. A man in his early 50s stepped out, wearing work clothes and a cautious expression. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor work and honest living, with graying hair and hands that looked capable of fixing most anything. Morning, he said, touching the brim of his baseball cap. I'm William Parker, Will to most folks around here. I run the auto repair shop down the mountain. His eyes took in the sagging porch and broken railings. Heard James's granddaughter was up here. Thought maybe you could use some practical advice. Ellie Morrison, she said, extending her hand. His grip was firm and calloused. And I suspect I can use all the advice I can get. Will's smile was genuine, if somewhat concerned. Your grandfather was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but he was fair in his dealings. He gestured at the cabin's deteriorating facade. This place, though, it's been going downhill for a long time. You think I should sell it? Ellie asked, voicing the practical option that kept circling in her mind. Will was quiet for a moment, studying the cabin with the eye of someone who understood construction. Depends on what you're looking for, he finally said. If you need the money, sell the land to someone who can afford to start over. He paused, then shrugged. But if you're looking for something else, well, James always claimed this place had good bones. Might be worth finding out if he was right. After Will left, promising to stop by again in a few days to check on her progress, Ellie found herself really looking at the cabin for the first time. Not at its decay and damage, but at the underlying structure her grandfather had built. The logs were oak, she realized, fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of real craftsmanship. The foundation stones were massive and carefully placed. Even the damage seemed mostly superficial, neglect rather than structural failure. As evening approached and the mountain air grew cool, Ellie built a fire in the old stone fireplace. The chimney drew well, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning oak. She sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag, studying her grandfather's letter by firelight, looking for clues she might have missed. That's when she noticed something odd about the fireplace itself. The stones were fitted with the same precision she'd observed in the cabin's construction, but one stone, about knee-high on the left side, seemed slightly different. The mortar around its edges was cleaner, newer looking than the rest. Heart racing with possibility, Ellie knelt beside the fireplace and pressed against the stone. It shifted slightly under pressure. She worked her fingers around its edges and, with a grinding sound of stone against stone, it moved inward, revealing a small cavity behind. Inside, her fingers found a folded piece of paper and something else, something smooth and carved. She pulled both items into the firelight and gasped at what she saw. The paper was another note in her grandfather's handwriting. The first step is always the hardest, but you've taken it. What you hold now opened doors for 3 generations of Morrisons. Use it well. The carved object was a piece of wood unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was no bigger than her palm, but every surface was covered in intricate inlay work, tiny pieces of different woods fitted together to create a pattern of leaves and vines so detailed and beautiful that it seemed to move in the flickering firelight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work she'd only seen in museums or the homes of the very wealthy. And suddenly, holding that small masterpiece in her hands, Ellie understood why her grandfather had been so careful to hide his work. This wasn't the hobby craft of an old mountain man. This was art of the highest caliber, work that belonged in galleries and private collections. The brass key in her pocket suddenly felt warm against her fingers, and she knew with the certainty that comes from deep recognition that tomorrow she would find what it opened. And when she did, her life would change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She spent the next day searching methodically, room by room, looking for anything she might have missed. It was when she returned to the main floor that she noticed something odd about the floorboards near the back wall. The boards ran east to west throughout most of the cabin, but in one small section, maybe 4 feet square, they ran north to south. Kneeling on the floor, she pressed against the boards, listening for hollow sounds. The third board from the wall gave slightly under pressure, and when she worked her fingers around its edges, she felt the telltale gap of a concealed hinge. Her heart pounding with excitement, she pried up the board to reveal a shallow compartment beneath. Inside was a wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age and use, and set into the center of the lid was a brass lock that perfectly matched her key. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been oiled recently. The lid opened to reveal another layer of treasures, more sample pieces like the ones she'd found in the fireplace, each showcasing different techniques and wood combinations. There was a leather-bound journal filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting and detailed sketches. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, was another key, larger and more ornate than the first. She spent the next hour searching with renewed intensity, looking for any lock or hidden compartment that might accept the ornate key. It was when she was examining the built-in shelves along the eastern wall that she noticed something peculiar. One section of shelving, about 3 feet wide, seemed shallower than the rest. Running her hands along the back panel, she felt the subtle outline of a rectangular seam. When she pressed against it, the panel moved slightly inward. She traced the edges with her fingers until she found what she was looking for. A small, concealed keyhole positioned at shoulder height. The bronze key slid in perfectly. When she turned it, she heard the soft click of a mechanism engaging, and the entire back panel swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The space beyond took her breath away. She was looking into a workshop that time had preserved in perfect detail. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on wooden pegboards, chisels, planes, carving knives, and instruments she couldn't even name. Wood samples were organized in careful rows, each piece labeled in her grandfather's meticulous script. And in the center of the room stood a masterpiece of workmanship, a cabinet of drawers so beautiful it seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through a small curtained window. But it wasn't just the beauty of the space that stunned her. It was the evidence of recent use. The tools were clean and sharp, the workbenches clear of dust. Someone had been caring for this workshop, maintaining it with the devotion of a shrine keeper. Her grandfather, she realized, had been using this space until very recently, perhaps until the illness that eventually claimed him. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs that covered the floor. The air smelled of wood shavings, linseed oil, and the distinctive scent of hand-cut lumber. It was like stepping back in time to an era when craftsmanship mattered more than efficiency, when beauty was worth the patience it took to create. On the main workbench, she found a project in progress, a jewelry box carved from a single piece of cherry wood, its surfaces partially completed with inlay work that matched the samples she discovered. Beside it lay a set of plans drawn in her grandfather's careful hand, showing every detail of the design down to the smallest decorative element. A sheet of paper tucked under the corner of the plans caught her attention. Another note from her grandfather, this one dated just 2 months before his death. Ellie, if you found this room, then you understand what I was trying to preserve. This workshop has been my life's work, but it was never meant for just one person. 3 generations of Morrisons learned their craft here, and now it's waiting for the fourth. I don't know if you have the patience for this kind of work, or the temperament. It's not easy learning to listen to wood and understanding what it wants to become. But if you're willing to try, everything you need is here. The tools, the techniques, the wood, even some of the old commission records, if you want to understand what this business once was. The choice is yours, granddaughter. You can seal this room back up and sell the land, and no one would blame you. Or you can take up the tools and see what your hands might create. Either way, you'll have my blessing. But if you choose the workshop, remember this. What we make here isn't just furniture or decoration. It's legacy made tangible, tradition given form. In a world that seems to value speed over beauty, maybe that still matters. The tools are waiting. Standing in that hidden workshop, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, Ellie felt something shift deep inside her chest. The corporate executive who had driven up the mountain 2 days ago, cynical, burned out, ready to cut her losses, seemed like a stranger now. And in her place stood someone she barely recognized but somehow remembered, a young girl who had once watched her grandfather's hands transform raw wood into wonder. Have you ever felt like giving up on something only to suddenly experience a breakthrough? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe because tomorrow I've prepared something special just for you. The first weeks were humbling. Ellie spent hours poring over her grandfather's journal, trying to understand the basics of the craft he had mastered. The entries spoke of commissions from wealthy families in Asheville and Charlotte, of custom furniture and decorative panels that sold for what would be thousands in today's money. But knowing and doing were worlds apart. Her first attempts at even the simplest techniques ended in frustration. Chisels that slipped and gouged the wood, saw cuts that wandered from their lines, joints that gaped like broken teeth. Her hands, once nimble with spreadsheets and presentations, seemed clumsy and uncertain with these ancient tools. Each failure reinforced the voice of doubt that had followed her from Boston, the whisper that said she wasn't good enough, that she was foolish to think she could master something so foreign to her experience. On the fourth day, after a particularly disastrous attempt at a basic dovetail joint, she threw down the chisel in frustration. "I can't do this," she muttered to the empty workshop. "I don't have the patience, the skill." And then, as if in answer, her grandfather's words from the journal seemed to speak directly to her. "The wood will teach you, but you have to be patient enough to listen. Every mistake is information. Every failed cut is a lesson in what not to do next time." She picked up the chisel again, studying its edge in the workshop's soft light. Rather than forcing it through the wood as she had been doing, she tried a different approach. Gentle pressure, letting the tool find its way along the grain. Suddenly, the chisel slid through the maple like it was butter, leaving a clean, precise cut behind. "Oh," she breathed, understanding dawning. "I don't need to fight the wood. I need to work with it." That small breakthrough changed everything. She began to approach each task not as a battle to be won, but as a conversation with the material. The wood did seem to have preferences, directions it wanted to be cut, angles that felt natural, grain patterns that suggested their own decoration. Will stopped by that afternoon, bringing sandwiches and news from town. He found her absorbed in practice cuts on a piece of pine, her focus so complete she barely heard his knock. "You've been busy," he observed, looking around at the scattered attempts and practice pieces. "It's harder than it looks," Ellie admitted, showing him a board marked with a dozen failed attempts before one acceptable cut. "But I think I'm starting to understand what he meant about listening to the wood." Will nodded, running his fingers along one of the successful cuts. "My nephew Matt, just graduated from the community college with a certificate in furniture making. He's been looking for someone to apprentice with, maybe learn some of the old school methods they don't teach in school anymore." The suggestion intrigued Ellie. Would he be interested in traditional hand tools? No power equipment, no shortcuts? Matt's got patience, and he respects the craft. His grandfather was a cabinet maker, so he understands the value of doing things right instead of doing them fast. Will smiled. "Of course, you'd have to actually know what you're doing before you could teach anyone else." The next day, Will brought Matt to the cabin. The young man was in his early 20s with the calloused hands of someone who'd already spent years working with wood. But his eyes held the eager curiosity of someone who knew there was still much to learn. "Wow," Matt said when Ellie showed him the workshop. "This is like stepping back in time. Are these all hand tools?" "Everyone," Ellie confirmed. "My grandfather believed that power tools made things faster, but not necessarily better. Everything in here was made the way craftsmen worked for hundreds of years before electricity changed the trade." Matt picked up one of the hand planes, testing its weight and examining the blade with the eye of someone who understood tool quality. "These are museum pieces. Some of them look like they're from the 19th century." Many of them are. The tradition was that each generation would add to the tool collection, but also maintain what came before. Nothing gets thrown away unless it's truly beyond repair. They spent the afternoon going through the basic techniques, with Ellie sharing what she'd learned and Matt offering insights from his formal training. The combination proved powerful, her growing understanding of traditional methods enhanced by his knowledge of wood science and modern finishing techniques. The thing is, Matt said as they worked on a practice joint together, school teaches you to be efficient, to get maximum output with minimum time investment. But this work, he gestured around the workshop, this is about something different. This is about making things that will outlast the people who make them. A week later, as Ellie and Matt were discussing plans for a small side table, her first real project, she made a remarkable discovery. In the bottom drawer of her grandfather's tool chest, wrapped in soft leather, she found a set of tiny carving tools unlike anything else in the workshop. Each piece was smaller than her pinky finger, with handles made from ancient ivory and blades of steel, so fine they seemed to glow in the workshop's light. When she unwrapped them fully, she gasped. Each tool bore tiny inscriptions, names and dates carefully etched into the handles. Heinrich Morrison, 1847. Wilhelm Morrison, 1873. James Morrison, Sr., 1912. These are the original tools, she whispered, hands trembling slightly. The ones my great-great-grandfather brought from Germany. Matt's eyes widened as he examined them. These aren't just tools, they're family heirlooms. The craftsmanship in just these handles is museum quality. A note in her grandfather's handwriting was wrapped with the tools. These belong to the masters before us. Use them only when you're ready to attempt work worthy of their legacy. As the days passed into weeks, Ellie discovered another treasure, a ledger hidden in the back of the workshop's deepest drawer. Wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with string, it contained records dating from 1943 to 1968, the golden years of the Morrison workshop. Each page detailed a specific project, client name, piece description, materials used, time required, and payment received. But it was the names that made her breath catch in her throat. The Vanderbilts had commissioned a dining room set in 1955. The Rockefellers had ordered custom built-ins for their Asheville estate. Governors, senators, and industrialists had all sought out the Morrison workshop for pieces that would grace their finest rooms. The payments recorded, thousands of dollars in the 1950s, represented fortunes by today's standards. Custom walnut secretary with mahogany inlay and secret compartments, read one entry from 1962. Client, Mrs. Elizabeth Peaton, Richmond, VA. Payment, $3,500. Ellie calculated quickly. That single piece would be worth perhaps $35,000 today, and the ledger contained hundreds of similar entries. Her grandfather hadn't been just a mountain craftsman. He'd been an artist whose work had furnished some of the most prestigious homes in the Southeast. But what struck her most deeply were the personal notes he'd written in the margins. Beside the Peaton entry, requested extra security for correspondence compartment, family letters from the war, handled with appropriate reverence. Next to a governor's commission, insisted on North Carolina cherry throughout, wants to support local timber. Good man. These weren't just business transactions. They were relationships built on mutual respect between craftsman and client, between someone who understood quality and someone who could create it. The peaceful exploration of her grandfather's legacy was interrupted one morning during her third week at the cabin by the arrival of 3 vehicles, a county car and 2 trucks bearing the local building department's logo. 3 men stood on her front porch, and none of them looked like they were bringing good news. The leader was a thin man in his 60s, wearing a suit that looked expensive, but out of place in the mountain setting. Behind him stood 2 younger men in work clothes, their arms crossed and expressions carefully neutral. "Miss Morrison, I'm George Hamilton from the County Planning Office. These gentlemen are from the Building Inspection Department. He gestured to his companions. We've had reports about someone attempting to occupy the structure. I'm afraid there are some serious safety concerns we need to address. Ellie stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. Good morning, Mr. Hamilton. I wasn't expecting an inspection this early in my renovation process. Hamilton's smile was professional but cold. Well, that's part of the problem, Miss Morrison. You can't legally occupy a structure that hasn't passed basic safety inspections. And frankly, just looking at this place from the outside, I can see multiple code violations. He pulled out a clipboard and began making notes. Unsafe porch railings, damaged roof, probable foundation issues. We're going to have to red tag this property. Red tag, condemned for human habitation, one of the inspectors said. You'll need to vacate immediately and bring everything up to current building codes before anyone can live here again. The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. She'd been here only a few weeks, and already the bureaucracy was moving to shut her down. How long would that process take? Hamilton consulted his clipboard. Current building codes for mountain construction. You're looking at 6 months minimum, assuming you can afford the necessary work. More likely a year or more. And that's if the structure is even worth saving. He shrugged, letting his doubt speak for itself. After they left, Ellie sat on the front steps and stared at the paperwork they'd handed her. The forms were intimidating, pages of regulations and requirements, estimated costs that made her savings account look pathetic, and timelines that stretched far beyond what she'd imagined. That evening, she made a disturbing discovery. While searching for sandpaper in her grandfather's storage cabinet, her fingers found an envelope taped to the back panel, hidden behind a collection of wood-stained samples. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and addressed to James Morrison in the formal script of legal correspondence. Inside were documents that made her sink into the workshop's single chair, her legs suddenly unsteady, property surveys, mineral rights assessments, and water usage permits, all bearing her grandfather's signature. According to the surveys, her grandfather had owned nearly 200 acres stretching along 3 miles of mountain ridge, including mineral rights to a substantial copper deposit and exclusive access to one of the region's largest underground springs. The water rights alone, in an area increasingly concerned about development and conservation, were worth more than she'd ever imagined. But it was the final document that made her hands tremble as she read. A formal appraisal commissioned just 6 months before her grandfather's death valued the complete property at $2.8 million. The cabin and immediate grounds that everyone had dismissed as worthless represented less than 10% of her actual inheritance. A handwritten note from her grandfather was clipped to the appraisal. They've been circling like vultures for years, waiting for me to die so they can divide up the land and sell the water rights to developers. I've kept quiet about what we really own. Let them think it's just a worthless old cabin and a few acres of trees. But you need to know the truth. This land has supported 4 generations of Morrisons, and it could support 4 more if you're strong enough to hold on to it. Suddenly, everything made sense. George Hamilton's harassment over the building permits, the pressure from townspeople to sell and move on, the comments about being better off with something more practical. They hadn't been trying to help her. They'd been trying to discourage her from staying, hoping she'd give up and put the property on the market. 3 days later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the cabin. A man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and polished leather shoes entirely unsuited to the mountain terrain, approached the porch where Ellie was having her morning coffee. Miss Morrison, I'm Andrew Reynolds from Blue Ridge Resort Development. His smile was practiced, professional. I understand you've inherited this property from your grandfather. I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity that could benefit us both. I'm listening, Ellie said, keeping her expression neutral. My company specializes in luxury mountain retreats. We've been interested in this area for some time, and your property, well, It has certain features that make it particularly valuable. He named a figure, $3.5 million cash, with closing in 30 days. That's generous, Ellie acknowledged, considering the condition of the cabin. Reynolds laughed softly. Oh, we wouldn't keep the cabin. The value is in the land itself, particularly the water rights. Of course, his tone shifted subtly. If you prefer to stay in the area, we understand there are challenges with mountain living, permit issues, infrastructure problems, the isolation. These things can become quite overwhelming for someone without local connections. His smile remained pleasant but cold. We'd hate to see you get in over your head with something too ambitious for the circumstances. After Reynolds left, Ellie knew she faced a decision that would determine not just her future, but the future of everything her grandfather had built and preserved. The practical voice in her head, the one that had guided her corporate career, said to take the money. $3.5 million would set her up for life anywhere she chose to live. But sitting in the workshop that evening, surrounded by tools that had shaped 4 generations of beautiful things, she found another voice growing stronger, the one that recognized this wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, tradition, and a way of understanding the world that valued patience, quality, and the long view of human creation. She picked up the carving knife her grandfather had been using on his final project, the unfinished jewelry box. The handle fit her palm as if it had been made for her, worn smooth by hands that shared her blood and her heritage. With sudden clarity, she knew what she had to do. She would fight for it all, the workshop, the land, the tradition, and the vision of something new that could emerge from their combination. During her search through the commission records, she found a name that kept appearing, Elizabeth Peaton, a client who had commissioned multiple pieces over the years. A note in the margin of her last commission indicated she was a curator for the Smithsonian's American Crafts Division. Could she still be alive? The phone number was still in her grandfather's address book. When Ellie called, she reached a woman in her early 80s whose voice carried the cultured accent of old Virginia money and the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent her life championing important causes. James's granddaughter, Mrs. Arn Peaton said when Ellie introduced herself. I wondered when I would hear from you. He spoke of you often, you know. Always hoped you would find your way back to the mountains eventually. They arranged a meeting, and over the next 4 months, with Elizabeth Peaton's guidance and connections, Ellie poured herself into 2 monumental tasks: mastering enough of her grandfather's techniques to create one showcase piece worthy of the Morrison name, and developing a business plan to transform the property into a craft education center that would preserve both the workshop traditions and the natural environment. The months were intense, filled with 12-hour days split between practicing woodworking techniques and drafting proposals for foundation funding. Matt became her unofficial apprentice and assistant, his formal training complementing her growing understanding of traditional methods. The project she chose as her masterpiece was an ambitious writing desk her grandfather had designed but never built, a piece that would incorporate every technique the workshop had developed over 4 generations: traditional joinery for the main structure, intricate inlay work that told the story of mountain seasons through patterns of leaves and flowers, hidden compartments accessible only to someone who understood the desk's secrets. By the time winter arrived, Ellie had transformed from a novice to a craftsperson with enough skill to execute her grandfather's design. The desk emerged from her hands, not perfect by a master's standards, but beautiful and honest, a testament to what determination and proper instruction could achieve in just months of dedicated work. Are you discovering hidden talents that others overlooked? Share your journey of rediscovery in the comments below. If you're enjoying this story of renewal, please subscribe for more tales of unexpected transformations. The morning of the gathering dawned cold and clear, with frost covering the mountain in a crystalline blanket that made the workshop's windows sparkle like diamonds. Ellie had been awake since before sunrise, making final adjustments to the masterpiece desk that would determine her future and the future of everything her grandfather had preserved. The completed piece stood in the center of the workshop like a wooden symphony. Every surface told the story of seasons and growth through patterns so intricate they seemed to breathe in the morning light. The desktop showed spring flowers giving way to summer leaves, then autumn's brilliant colors, finally culminating in winter's stark beauty, rendered in pale woods that caught the light like snow. Elizabeth Peaton arrived first, accompanied by her grandson, Michael, and a small convoy of vehicles carrying the collectors, foundation representatives, and craft experts who would evaluate Ellie's work. Among them were curators from the Smithsonian, professors from the nation's finest art schools, and private collectors whose approval could make or break a craftsperson's reputation. "My word," said Dr. Patricia Winters, the Smithsonian's curator of American crafts, as she entered the workshop. "This space is extraordinary. It's like stepping into the 19th century, but with all the knowledge and skill intact." Ellie felt her hands trembling as she began the demonstration that would showcase both the desk and the techniques used to create it. She had prepared for weeks, practicing her explanations of each process, but standing before this audience of experts, she felt like a student facing the most important examination of her life. "The Morrison Workshop has preserved techniques that date back to medieval European guilds," she began, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject. "Every tool you see here was made by hand, maintained across generations, and used to create furniture that graced some of the finest homes in the Southeast." She walked them through the desk's construction, explaining how each joint had been cut by hand, how the inlay patterns had been designed to work with the wood's natural grain, how the hidden mechanisms had been engineered to operate smoothly for decades without maintenance. As she spoke, she demonstrated techniques on sample pieces, showing how patient handwork could achieve results that no machine could duplicate. The audience was clearly impressed, but it was the desk itself that would provide the ultimate test. Dr. Winters approached it with the careful attention of someone who had examined hundreds of similar pieces, her experienced eye-catching details that would reveal the quality of the workmanship. "The joinery is exceptional," she murmured, running her fingers along edges so perfectly fitted that the joints were nearly invisible. "And this inlay work, I've seen similar techniques in European museums, but never executed with this level of precision." One by one, Ellie revealed the desk's hidden features, the secret compartment that opened when a specific sequence of inlay pieces was pressed, the adjustable writing surface that could be raised or lowered to accommodate different tasks, the small drawers that slid out from seemingly solid wood when their triggers were activated. Each revelation brought gasps of appreciation from the audience. These weren't just mechanical tricks. They were solutions to practical problems, innovations that made the desk more useful while adding to its beauty and mystery, the kind of thoughtful design that distinguished true craftsmanship from mere technique. The afternoon session took place in the cabin's main room, where the restored interior provided a perfect backdrop for discussing the integration of traditional crafts with modern conservation efforts. Michael Peaton had set up displays showing the property's full extent, the mineral rights and water resources that made it valuable, and the legal mechanisms that could protect it while generating sustainable income. "What we're proposing," Ellie began, "is something that's never been attempted at this scale, a working craft workshop that also serves as a teaching center, anchored by conservation protections that preserve both the natural environment and the cultural traditions it has supported." She outlined her vision methodically, drawing on her corporate experience to present a business plan that addressed every concern the foundation representatives might raise. Traditional craft workshops for serious students, weekend programs for hobbyists, artist residencies for established craftspeople wanting to explore historical techniques, environmental education programs, that would use the property's forests and watersheds as living laboratories. The beauty of this approach is that it makes the conservation economically sustainable. Instead of preserving the property as a static monument to the past, we're creating something dynamic, a place where tradition continues to evolve and grow. The moment of truth came when James Hartford, a collector known for his demanding standards, asked the question everyone was thinking. This is an ambitious proposal, Miss Morrison, but ambition without execution is just dreaming. What evidence do we have that you can actually deliver on these plans? Ellie smiled, walking over to the masterpiece desk that anchored her workshop. 6 months ago, I couldn't tell a dovetail joint from a mortise and tenon. I'd never used a hand plane, never cut an inlay, never understood how wood moves and breathes and responds to patient work. She ran her hand along the desk's perfect edge. This piece represents not just what I've learned, but what anyone can learn if they have access to proper instruction, quality tools, and the time to develop their skills properly. She paused, looking around the room at faces that had moved from skepticism to genuine interest over the course of the day. That's what this workshop can offer, the complete package that's disappeared from most of the world. Not just classes or demonstrations, but full immersion in a working craft tradition that connects people to something larger than themselves. Elizabeth Peaton stood, and the room fell quiet. Her endorsement would carry enormous weight with the foundation representatives who would ultimately decide the project's funding. I've been collecting American crafts for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinion shaped markets. I've seen countless examples of traditional work, and I've watched dozens of revival efforts fail because they focused on nostalgia instead of excellence. She gestured toward the desk. What Ellie has accomplished here, mastering techniques that took her grandfather decades to perfect, and then creating something that honors tradition while advancing it, this is the real thing. 6 months later, on a warm morning in early June, Ellie stood on the front porch of the completely restored cabin and watched the first official workshop students arrive for what would become an annual tradition. The building behind her bore no resemblance to the wreck she'd inherited just over a year ago. The roof was solid, the windows clear, and the porch railings were sturdy enough to support the carved sign that announced Morrison Workshop, Traditional Crafts Education Center, established 1923, renewed 2025. The sign itself was a masterpiece of the craft, hand-carved oak with inlay work that told the story of the workshop's renewal through patterns of growth, seasons, and continuity. Matt had created it as his graduation piece after completing the first formal apprenticeship program the workshop had offered. The morning's arrivals included a retired engineer from Atlanta who wanted to understand pre-industrial construction techniques, a furniture designer from New York seeking inspiration from historical methods, and a young woman fresh from art school who had driven from California specifically to study Morrison inlay work. Will's truck pulled into the circular drive that had replaced the old dirt track. These days he served as the workshop's general contractor, overseeing the construction of student dormitories and additional workspace that kept the programs growing while preserving the essential character of the place. "Morning, Miss Morrison," he called. "Got those new workbenches loaded up. Matt said you wanted them in place before the afternoon session." The expansion had been carefully planned to maintain the workshop's intimate scale while accommodating increased demand. The original space remained exactly as her grandfather had left it, but adjacent buildings now housed additional workstations, a library of craft books and historical documents, and living quarters for students attending the intensive month-long programs that had become the workshop's signature offering. Martha Henley emerged from the main cabin carrying a stack of historical documents. Her role as the workshop's archivist had evolved into something approaching full-time work as researchers from universities across the country sought access to the Morrison family papers and the oral history project she was conducting with longtime mountain residents. The Smithsonian Courier will be here this afternoon for the latest documentation, Martha reported. Dr. Winters is particularly excited about the photographs of James's work from the 1960s that we found in the attic. Apparently, several pieces she's been tracking have been identified from those images. The workshop's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. The waiting list for intensive programs stretched nearly 2 years into the future. Commission requests arrived weekly from collectors who wanted pieces created using traditional methods. Most importantly, the conservation programs were working exactly as planned. The land was protected, the mineral and water rights provided sustainable income, and the cultural traditions were not just preserved, but actively growing. George Hamilton's harassment had ended abruptly once the legal protections were in place, and the property's true value became public knowledge. The development interests that had been pressuring longtime residents suddenly found themselves facing a formidable opponent in the form of conservation lawyers with unlimited funding and a mandate to preserve mountain communities. Several other families had followed Ellie's example, placing their properties under similar protections. But the change Ellie valued most was internal. The transformation she felt every morning when she unlocked the workshop and prepared to spend another day creating beautiful, lasting things. The corporate executive who had arrived here broken and directionless seemed like a different person now. In her place stood someone whose identity was rooted in craft, teaching, and stewardship, roles that felt more authentic than anything she had ever done in boardrooms or conference calls. The afternoon brought the moment she treasured most, the demonstration period when students worked on individual projects while she moved among them, offering guidance and sharing the techniques she was still mastering herself. Today's focus was on advanced joinery, and she watched with satisfaction as each student discovered the moment when theory became practice, when their hands began to understand what their minds had learned. "The wood is fighting me," complained the engineer, struggling with a dovetail joint that refused to fit properly. "The wood isn't fighting," Ellie corrected gently, taking the chisel from his hands and making a few careful adjustments. "You're fighting the wood. Try working with it instead. Feel how the grain wants to be cut, then help it along." She demonstrated the technique, showing how patient observation could reveal the path the tool wanted to follow. These moments, watching someone discover their capacity for creating beauty, seeing hands learn to work with materials that had grown and lived and carried their own wisdom, these were the rewards that made all the challenges worthwhile. As evening approached and the students gathered their tools for the day, Ellie found herself alone in the original workshop space. The masterpiece desk occupied its place of honor, no longer her test piece, but her teacher, a daily reminder of what was possible when skill, patience, and vision combined in service of something larger than individual ambition. She pulled out her grandfather's journal and added her own entry to the continuing record. "Today we welcome the third class of intensive students. Each one brings something different to the tradition. New questions, fresh perspectives, innovations that honor the past while pointing toward the future. The workshop lives not in the building or the tools, but in the hands that are willing to learn and the hearts that understand why this work matters." Outside, the mountain evening settled over the workshop with the peaceful satisfaction of work well done and promises well kept. The tradition was safe, growing, and ready for whatever the next generation would bring to it. In the end, that was exactly what her grandfather had hoped for when he preserved these tools and techniques through the lean years when the world seemed to have forgotten their value. The Morrison workshop would continue one careful cut and patient joint at a time, creating beauty that would outlast the hands that shaped it and inspire others to take up the ancient, essential work of making the world more beautiful than they found it. Sometimes life takes us to unexpected crossroad where we discover our true worth when everything seems lost. Like Ellie, we all have the capacity to uncover new skills and purpose, even when the world has given up on us. Have you ever found unexpected value in something others considered worthless? Share your story in the comments below.